So, we haven't done one of these in a while, but welcome to the Combat Initiation Review. Initially, this was going to be a first impressions video, but after playing the game, I couldn't do it so much as a disservice to do that, so we got a full-scale review. Now, with that previous sentence, you can probably guess that this game is fan-fucking-tastic. Don't demonetize me, YouTube. Seriously, this game absolutely kicks ass. If you haven't played it already, what the hell are you doing? It's in the description. Go play it right now. I mean it. You can click off the video. I know I'm not supposed to do that as a YouTuber. Click off the video, go play the game, because it's great. There's going to be spoilers. They're not the end of the world, but you should really experience this for yourself. Go play it. Anyways, that being said, I don't want to beat around the bush too much, so we're going to kick things off. And the first thing that I want to talk about is, of course, the most important thing, which is the gameplay. The gameplay in Combat Initiation is, well, the whole game, so it better be good. And goddamn is it. Combat Initiation's general concept is not anything that we haven't seen before. That being said, the execution is so fantastic, that's what really sets it apart from so many other different games. The premise is very, very simple. You hop into an elevator with up to 6 players, you pick 2 weapons that you want to use before the game starts, and once the game does begin, you need to survive against waves of enemies until a boss appears. Take out the boss, and you can move on to the next floor. Now, obviously, there are a lot more nuances to the game than just this. Seeing as this game is a roguelike or roguelite game, whatever the hell you want to call it, every single run that you're going to play can be radically different, depending on what you choose to do, as well as what tools the game gives you. This is because not only can you pick a different weapon at the start of the round, but in between certain milestones and waves, you're able to either upgrade or buy different weapons that you can then have access to. You also have the opportunity, after defeating the boss at the end of a stage, to pick a gear. The gears that you can pick from fluctuate massively in their purpose, how helpful they are, and just generally what they do. You get the choice of 4 of them at the end of every stage, so odds are one of the ones that you can pick from is going to be supportive of the build that you're currently running. And if it isn't, you can always buy a weapon or some sort of build item that you need in order to make the gear that you've acquired better. Overall, the balance of the weapons and gear seems to be pretty all over the place, but when you consider the fact that this is a single-player game, or at the very most competitive, a cooperative game, I'm not super worried about which weapons are good and which weapons are bad. All of the weapons I used, which was a majority of them, were fun to use, and it doesn't really matter how effective the weapons are as long as they're enjoyable. That being said, I did notice that the swords felt a little weak, but I think that probably stems from the fact that they're very clearly intended to be a secondary that you pull out directly to parry attacks and such, rather than being a weapon that you're relying on the entire time. I tried to do a run where I just went through mainly using the sword, and it was miserable, so I cannot recommend that. In terms of different combos, you can really break the game here, and it gets pretty crazy pretty quickly. The most hilarious thing that I found was the combination between Ninja Stars, the rocket launcher, and this drink that you can acquire that's a gear that makes it so your cooldowns are significantly lower. Now, the Ninja Stars is probably one of the coolest weapons in the entire game. The stars themselves do a lot of damage, but your alternate fire throws a kunai that effectively makes a black hole. All of your Ninja Stars that are currently on the field will basically do a circle of death around this kunai, as well as the fact that it will pull in any sort of projectiles that you shoot near it, including rockets. Now, you probably see where this is going. I figured out quite quickly that if I threw my kunai onto something and then drank the thing, that made it incredibly difficult to aim, but made me able to spam rockets at warp speed, I could throw the kunai, drink the drink, and completely obliterate whatever had the kunai on it because, well, it was getting hit with like 60 missiles. I'm sure there's several other combinations very similar to stuff like this. It's hilarious, it's super fun to use, it's super fun to experiment, and I just really have nothing but good things to say about pretty much everything on the gameplay front. The variety of enemy types on display here is basically perfect. You've got anything from your default mindless melee enemy that charges right at you that's extremely weak, to snipers that hang all the way back, have a ton of health, and will aim directly at you with a laser warning you that you're about to get shot. If I went into every single enemy that there is in the game, we would literally be here all day, so I'm not gonna do that, but just take my word for it, or take it from the gameplay that you're seeing, that there is a huge list of enemies, all posing different levels of threats, and it makes threat prioritization in-game extremely important, as well as not prioritizing threats properly, potentially making levels significantly more difficult than they otherwise might be. All in all, everything on offer when it comes to gameplay is just fantastic, and the biggest complaint that I have is that there isn't more. That's literally it. And if that's the only complaint I have, you nailed it. Level design and combat initiation is kind of interesting because I think on a lot of fronts it succeeds with flying colors, and then on other fronts, well, it's sort of odd or just flat out fails. Obviously, the art style is inspired by classic Roblox here, so the environments pretty much mimic that. The actual visuals and the environments themselves are pretty solid, but I did start to draw some issues when it came to the third level of the game in the snow. Up until this point, there have been some levels of verticality, but usually you don't need to interact with them, which is kind of a shame in of itself, but playing this level, maybe it isn't. Because once you get to this level, they start to put enemies up on the cliffs, and this is where the gameplay sort of doesn't lend itself a lot of the time to more vertical areas. The most egregious was definitely when the game decides that it should put a tank on top of this small tower, and there's just not enough room for you to fight the tank on this tower. It feels super awkward, and if you fall down, there's a good chance that you fall down into this giant pit, and now you need to walk up the steps, then you need to walk all the way up this tower again, and I also want to make it known that you can't rocket jump on top of the tower either because it's too tall, and that would have alleviated a lot of the issues here, but you can't do it. Generally, it feels like quite a bit of a nitpick, but I can't see how anyone couldn't have seen this being at least a little bit frustrating while trying to play through. After all, if you fire an explosive too close to the tank, and explosives are reasonably good against tanks, it's a tank, you'll knock yourself off and then you're gonna fall in the hole again. It's not that hard to deal with, you just decide to not use an explosive weapon or use your explosive weapon from further down and snipe it. But overall, it just feels like enemies shouldn't spawn up here because it's just kind of awkward. And it sort of goes the same way when it comes to snipers and such on these cliffs. If you have a weapon that can deal with them that's hit scan, like the BB gun, you don't really have too many issues. But if you're using closer range weapons, a lot of this map is just open when it's not on the cliffs, and so you're just sort of dealing with constantly having to run away from the snipers, and there's nothing that you can really do to get in between the snipers and yourself, which leads you to just running around targeting snipers for a good chunk of the waves. And it's not very fun to have to directly always target the snipers because there's no cover. It's kind of a shame that this is the only map that I really found any sorts of problems, anything like this, because the map after this is hands down the best and most interesting map in the game, considering that you can fall off the map and take boatloads of damage, but if you can land on the trampolines on the bottom, you won't take any damage. It's a really enjoyable and difficult map to navigate, and I think a lot of that stems from the fact that it's pretty much entirely flat. Regardless, I don't want to harp on level design too long because, as I said, it's mostly nitpicks. Let's move on to the progression. Progression's a hard one, because I feel like they knew that they were going to run into problems with this, but they didn't really know what to do, and I can't say I totally blame them for that. To say the progression is lacking is putting it lightly, and this tends to be a problem with a lot of Roblox games, so I'm not hugely surprised. I'm sure a lot of this stems from the fact that they wanted it to be a roguelike game, so every time you go in it's going to be different, and so they wanted to have a lot of different options for you to pick from, but I will say that having all of the options available to you from the start without any sort of unlock system, I think is sort of to the game's detriment. There are two things that you can get out of doing runs that will make subsequent runs better or easier. and those two things are a singular gear piece that you can equip on your character that has a modifier, as well as the knowledge that you gained from the run. Now, one of those barely even counts, because the knowledge that you gained from the run, while valuable, isn't really progression. So what it ends up coming down to is just a piece of equipment that you can equip that gives you some sort of modifier, and that's it. I also think they dropped the ball because, as far as I could tell, like I said, you can only equip one of these. So you can only have one modifier available at any given time, and none of them are hugely impactful, which means that the actual impact of your decisions before you enter and that you got for playing the game is very minimal. I think this is a shame for several reasons. Number one, because I'm sure lower skilled players need help when it comes to boosting up their power levels, and the best that they can get is play over and over again until they can eventually unlock better items that can carry them through stages that they maybe otherwise can't handle, something that just is completely unavailable here and you can't do, which means, I guess, get good or drown, which I know a lot of people like, but as somebody who likes their games to be accessible to as many people as possible, not just get good or drown, yeah, I wish there was some sort of progression system here. Obviously, at the point we're at, it wouldn't make any sense to rip out upgrades and lock them behind level or XP requirements, but I did think it was just very, very strange that they have a leveling system in the game, but it seems to mean absolutely nothing. It doesn't do anything, so I just have to question why it's even there to begin with. At the end of the day, the progression sort of face plants, and that's a shame, but I don't think it's a reason to not give the game a shot, because even if you just play the game for 3 hours, that's 3 hours well spent. So I talked just a second ago about get good or drown. And so I guess this is the point where I have to sort of absolve myself from all the get good comments by telling you guys that I beat the entire game on my first attempt by myself. So before you go into the comments and say, Eclipse, you suck, get good, you couldn't beat it, well, I did beat it. Did I die a fair few times? Yes. Did I lose some of my server lives? Yes. But I completed it without game overing by myself, and I think that should speak enough to the point that I have some sort of semblance of being allowed to have an opinion on this. So, what do I think about the difficulty? Well, in its current state, I think it's in a pretty solid spot, but I do wish for some of the players who are less skilled, there was an easier difficulty for them. For the most part, I played the game solo, but I did decide to play around online with a bunch of other teammates, and a lot of them I quickly lost because they were struggling very hard, kept dying over and over again, and barely were able to do anything. And I felt really bad for those people because they're not going to be able to experience the phenomenal boss fights in this game because they likely won't get that far unless there's someone like me hard carrying them. And even if there is, they're liable to quit because they keep dying and they're just not having fun. And watching someone else fight the boss is not super entertaining. I also find it pretty surprising that there isn't a more difficult mode on top of a less difficult mode. In its current state, there's Standard Mode and Sandbox, which admittedly I've not played. That being said, the Standard Mode for difficulty when it comes to if you're playing with 6 relatively competent players, I'm sure that's in a pretty good spot. I just wish that there was more tweakability here, and I think that would really help the game for all different skill levels of players. I don't think that the difficulty is the end of the world, and like I said, for me, it was fine, but I can absolutely see for a lot of other players it being problematic, and so I hope for the sake of those people, they get some more tuning options in the future. Holy shit, they killed it. You guys know that I'm passionate about sound design and music in games, and oh my god, it's so fucking good! What the hell? The combination of classic Roblox sound effects on top of the absolutely euphoric soundtrack is just so good. The only tiny nitpick that I have about the sound and sound design is that the sort of cringy death noises that play every single time you kill an enemy get a little bit old after you've been playing for a hot minute, but that, again, it's a nitpick at best and barely makes any real difference in terms of the enjoyment of the game. I couldn't find the credits for the game, so I don't know who's directly responsible for the sound design and who's directly responsible for the music. The best I got was this Poto guy on YouTube who uploaded the soundtrack, and I think made the soundtrack, but I have no idea. If they end up watching this video and they're the ones who made it, hats off to you, man. You absolutely killed it. If it wasn't you, whoever made the soundtrack for this game, hats off to them. They absolutely killed it. And just, goddamn. That's all I got to say. Overall, as I said, Combat Initiation is just great. It's so good, and I could not recommend it more to basically anyone. So of course that leaves us at the final verdict. What score does Combat Initiation get? And personally, I think it would be absolutely criminal to not give this game an extremely high 9 out of 10. This is the kind of game that you compare other games to in the genre later down the line. It's on the level of Deep Woken or Titan Warfare. It's that good. Now, it did end up just shy of a 10 out of 10 because the longevity on this game seems very, very dire, and that's the only reason that I can't give it a 10. I think the lack of progression is really gonna hurt the game in the long run, and eventually it'll probably suffer the same fate of games like ours that have the exact same problems. Overall, only time will tell on that stuff, and the best that I can do is predict things the best I can. If you haven't been convinced to play the game yet, and you haven't already, I have one final trick up my sleeve. It's a spoiler. If you don't want spoilers and somehow you haven't been spoiled already, this one's a big one, but I just, like, this is Scion of Etheron levels cool as hell. I can't. Just look. You fight a giant Godzilla robot. Play the game, man!